Welcome to the TTC Online and Blended Learning course conversation. I'm very excited to have two guests join me tonight. Dr. Arnie Bieber, the director of the International School of Prague in the Czech Republic, and Teresa, the director for learning, research, and development at the International School of Prague. And we're going to explore the idea of learning and grades, and I'm really excited to hear from them about the work and the journey that they've embarked with their learning community over the last few years specific to grades. Sit back and enjoy the conversation.
Do you want to start or?
Either way, I'll speak about it and perhaps in broader terms, and then we can get into more details. Firstly, I would not characterize where we are as having transformed grading at our school, because we haven't. We're still definitely on that journey. I think, to our credit, what we've done is we've been willing to surface the issues with our community and come up with strategies to try to move away from grading so that we can really focus on learning. And so the premise really is connected to what do we know about the research concerning how kids or anyone learns best, and what role do grades play in helping or hindering the learning. And from everything we have read and looked at, and I know you've presented Alfie Kohn's Punished by Rewards, which came out, I think, was in the early 90s. He wrote an article, actually, I think it's a chapter in the book, which is, I think it's something like From Grading to Degrading. And the idea behind that is that's one of the problems with grades, is that actually it can be quite degrading. And that the research tells us that if students get low marks, they often take it personally and feel that they're not up to the task, or they're even stupid. For example, there's lots of research about how grades hinder risk-taking, and how it becomes all about the reward of the grade versus the journey, the learning journey. And so knowing that, for all of us, it's all about learning. Ultimately, that's why we do what we do. We felt that we had to take a stab at trying to move ourselves along and not get stuck in the world of grades that we've been using for hundreds of years. And so we came up with some strategies to try to move the community along. I would say, just one other point, that in our elementary school, essentially the teachers are not really grading. There's a symbol like with an arrow and a slider on the report card. But as far as the kids are concerned, they're not seeing grades from the teachers. They're really getting primarily, I think, the attempt is to have meaningful feedback. So the battle was not particularly in the elementary school. It's really in the middle and the upper school that we wanted to move this forward, and we felt that the place to start was in the middle school. I'll ask Teresa to take it on from there.
Sure. I guess to build on what Arnie said, we are trying to be student-centered, learning-focused. And so that brings up the point is, first of all, what is our image of the learner? Is it someone who does school, or do we have another image? And I think our image of the learner is everybody can learn, and everybody should learn and be passionate about their learning and be intrinsically motivated. And a lot of this has to do with motivation as well. So the image of the learner, and then what do we mean by learning? If learning really, and it's our definition of learning, is building on what you can already do, building on your understandings, then it's a continuum, it's a journey. One of our learning principles is how do we take learners, and learners take themselves from where they are and move forward? And that's really what we're all about. It's one of our key principles, why we exist. So, and once you've defined that as that's what we mean by learning, then we need to make that happen. And how do we best make that happen? How do we support that? So then we need to start looking at the systems and structures in place, what's helping or hindering, as Arnie said. And we know, based on the research, it's actually grades get in the way of the learning, what we've defined learning, and it gets in the way of well-being and a sense of belonging. These are key principles for us as well. So if we really truly want intrinsically motivated and passionate learners, lifelong learners, then we need to have them meet them where they're at. And so we really started this as a provocation and an option. So we started as a prototype and really driven from our mission and from our definition of learning, our learning principles. And we've had each year about 10 to 15% of parents opt in. And we were very specific. We really wanted this as a choice at this point in time, because this is a huge cultural shift. We're working at 100 years, more than 100 years, cultural shift here. And so we had to actually have a commitment for both the student and the parents, because sometimes a parent would want to opt in because they understand the research. Sometimes but the child wouldn't, or the student would and the parent would. So that was part of our option, that they had to opt into both. Both people had to opt in. So again, what we're noticing, and obviously very disturbing, rather than when we'd walk around in student-led conferences, what are you learning? Why are you learning? What's your next best step? Rather would hear, I don't know, I got a 6, I got a 7, or they would hear the students talk to them. What'd you get? What'd you get? And they'd talk about their number on a rubric versus really what they were learning and what was their next step in that learning. So again, one of our primary impact that we were after was our learning principle about learners will know where they're at and how to move forward, because that's really the heart of everything. And so it was our primary impact that we're after. And really the impact we saw right away in the first year of our prototype is it did a cultural shift for the teachers. So even though we only had 15% of the people involved, we had a huge impact, because teachers realized, like, oh, if I'm going to do it for this, why wouldn't I give everybody this good feedback? And that's where we really saw the impact is really qualitative feedback and really moving those learners forward. So, and feedback.
Sorry, if I can just interject there, just to be clear, the idea was that we brought it to the parents and the kids. We ran workshops to talk about the research, about grading and so on, and why we strongly believe this is the best way forward for learners. And the kids were given the option to opt in or not, as Teresa said, with their families. And we're talking about every year about 15% of the middle school students, groups of middle school students have opted in. But all of the teachers are doing it. So because they have 15%, they have those kids spread out in all the classes, there's always a number of students that they have to contend with not giving grades to. And as Teresa was saying, therefore, their big aha was, if I'm giving powerful, meaningful feedback for these kids who aren't getting grades, why wouldn't I be doing that for the kids who are getting grades? And so that was one of the early kind of wins that came away from that.
So you say there was an opt-in opportunity for parents and students, and then both parent and student had to have a collective buy-in. So the parents that didn't opt in, or the student opt in, they would continue with the grade. So there was basically there were two options that you could pick. And at any time, I assume people could switch out of the non-grading and into the grading, and vice versa? Or was it a long-term commitment for the academic year?
We asked for a commitment for the academic year, and because we wanted to meet with them and get feedback and whatnot. And I think what it really shifted is because teachers had somehow gotten into this, every time we have a task or in a learning engagement, then they would throw a rubric at it and give it a number. And it just got into this, that's what it was all about. And so again, because of the grade-free option and that 10 to 15% every year, is they just shifted not grading as often, right? So yes, they still get reports, and they still get reports 4 times a year in the middle school. But again, a lot less grading and marking of every single thing that the child did during the learning.
And you mentioned the idea of three-way conferences, parent-teacher conferences. So that whole workflow is still prominent. In other words, where the parent, the student, and the teacher are having those conversations around the portfolio. Are there artifacts like projects? What are kind of the artifacts that support this journey that kids are engaging with?
I think a lot of that depends on the discipline, and it depends on the teacher and the student. And again, the challenge of portfolios, they can be, is it really owned by the learner, or is it just it become this structure? And yes, we do portfolios, and they have to fill this out, portfolios, and then they set their goals, but it really becomes yet another hoop jumping game. So how do we really make the ownership with the learner? Do they really own this? Are they intrinsically motivated? And I think that's what came through really on our first year of prototyping, that we were really tackling grades because we thought it was getting it was interfering with them actually moving forward, as well as their attitude and why they were giving effort. So we definitely saw the biggest thing is intrinsic motivation, because we have these, what we came to be known as the 7 chasers, right? They just want the 6 or the 7. And again, you say, why? What is this? Well, how are you getting better? And then lots of times they couldn't say that. So again, we knew we were really working on really quality feedback to move the learners forward, and really getting a shift of paradigm that we're all about learning growth and helping that learner move forward versus comparison. Grades is just about comparison, some arbitrary set, oh, this is what you should be at this age. Why? There are a million reasons why a learner is where they're at. I'd suggest you read The End of Average by Ted Rose, I think, from out of Harvard. But again, it's such an archaic paradigm. Again, are we about learning or not? Are we about judging and comparing? And that doesn't make sense at all. And it doesn't make sense from our definition, for our context, because we've defined what we mean by learning, what we mean, how that learning best happens, and what is our added value? Why are people coming to us, and what's our added value to help them on this learning journey?
And just to build on that, I think whether it's grades or other issues that we've done at schools forever, Benjamin Zander said it's all invented. Everything that we do in school and lots of other parts of life is invented. Moses did not come down with the 11th commandment about grades. That's something that we invented and we maintain. And the other quote I like is from Grant Wiggins, who said that the point of school is not to get good at school. And again, it's all part of this sort of institutional functioning, but it's not really focused on learning. And I think it's also about the other reason that grades have flourished, if you will, for so many centuries, literally, is that it's easier or it's perceived as being easier by the educator because they can put a number or a letter or a symbol to define or evaluate the learning. And it's actually a very simplistic approach, which doesn't do a lot for the learner. So given that we know that this really gets in the way of learning, it's a good fight. It's fighting the good fight. It's the right thing to push for. And the more schools that do that and band together, the more powerful this can be. The other thing that you brought up before, John, and before we started taping, was that all the concerns connected to no grades. In that, kids do the IB, they do the GCSEs, they need GPAs for universities. There's a whole gamut of institutional requirements that exist external to schools. Firstly, I don't believe that's just to answer that a little bit myself, and obviously I want Teresa and you guys to jump in as well. But I don't think we have to use that as an excuse for what we know is the right thing to do. And it's not, one thing that schools I've seen do is sort of blame, well, it's universities, it's parents, it's, the reality is it's all of us, it's this circular system and we feed into it as well. And so there are things that we have to do in the way we currently function. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do those things with our eyes open and know what the downside of grades and all of those things are, and then find ways to make it better and to eventually do away with it so that we can get as close to the actual learning as possible.
You, throughout the conversation, and I know, Teresa, you really highlighted this idea of learning, what is learning, and really having some principles. And I know before we start taping, we were talking about how schools throw that word learning, and we're learning community, lifelong learner, it's all over the missions, and so that word is used very liberally, and sometimes it's as if we have that word, then we're covered. And I think what I really resonated with me is this idea of really unpacking what does that mean in our context in our school, and what do these principles then stand for, and what does it look like? And I'm wondering if that's maybe the journey, and I think you insinuated that that's where you start, is really understanding your context and what does learning mean within your school or your country. And every school is very different. And I don't know if you want to address that again, because I think that's a really important piece, is that you started with learning. You really didn't even talk about the grades, because that's what we're about, is learning. So I don't know if you want to add to that or any other further reflections, because it really, I think, is an important point.
No, I think you're right, John. I think we always say we're learning centered, we're all about learning. Well, then how are we actually realizing that? And are we really sticking to that? So our definition of learning is that you build on what you know and can deepen what you understand. So it means you're just on a journey. It's a continuum, right? So learning is a continuum. And so regardless of where you are, you're there where you are. And our responsibility is to take you forward. So how do we do that? Number one, we believe in intrinsic motivation. So one of our key principles is learners' curiosity drives what and how they learn. That basically means they're driven intrinsically. But grades is all the opposites, the carrot, the stick. It's what Alfie Cohen talks about. It's that extrinsic motivation. We know that's not going to be lifelong. That's playing a game. They won't take risks if they're not doing that. If they're doing it for a grade, and they really put boundaries on themselves as well. We actually, some of the students would talk about in the first year of the prototype, not only was it learning without stress, but it was really learning, and grade free is school without boundaries, because they used to just play this game. And what does it take me to get a 6 or a 7? Or grade free is being free from judgment. It's just about the learning. It's a more real life, fun way to learn. So again, if we really believe and we want lifelong learners, well, then we have to be intrinsically motivated. So that's a key one. And then learners know what they're learning and why it's significant. So if they're just playing a game, they're not necessarily, sometimes I'd ask, well, what are you learning here? They could say what they're learning, but then you'd ask why. And they couldn't say, well, I have to, because that's what I have to do. I have to get this, do this to get a 6, or I have to do this to get a 7. Well, if there's no relevance, they should refuse. We should be nurturing learners that refuse to learn if they don't know why they're learning, if there's no relevance for themselves or for the world. And then the big one was really learners know where they're at as learners and how to go further, because we know metacognition is everything. They need to be the drivers. They need to be the agentive people here. They're the owners. They're the learners. That's the only way they're going to ultimately become independent and drive their own learning and be lifelong learners. So those are 3 of our key learning principles that really that we hit around this prototype. And so really it shifts for me, assessment, it is, it goes back to the etymology of that word, is sitting side by side and coaching and helping that person from wherever they are. Well, that has huge impacts. So how clear are we about that continuum of learning? It's very obvious in language learning, right? We have the CEFR from the European Union. It's clearer in some areas than others. But how do we get the shift versus, what am I responsible as a teacher? Am I just covering? I covered this, I taught this. No, it's where's the learner and how do I nurture that learner forward? That's really our added value and what we're responsible for as professionals, in my opinion.
And I know, Arnie, we've talked a lot about this idea of you can have all these great principles and missions and values, but what do you do to walk the talk? And I think there's a level of courageousness and a level of almost gutsiness to say, this is so important, whatever everybody else is saying is wrong, or this is crazy, is this idea of walking the talk. And I don't know if you can maybe talk about that in regards to your faculty, and what was it that as a leader, and both of you are leaders and senior leaders in your school, how did you curate that understanding that we're going to walk the talk, trust us, we're going to make this happen? And I'm just curious, walking the talk is very difficult. We can talk about it, but actually doing it is where the courageousness comes. I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
Of course I do, John.
I know you do.
Well, we worked together for a long time. So, it really has started from the mission of the school. And the learning principles come from the mission. They're not in opposition to the mission to inspire, engage, and empower learners. And from the very beginning, when we created that mission, and you were there at the inception, we didn't just say inspire, engage, empower, and there were words underneath each one. We said, and we really mean it. And that means that we are constantly going to be challenging ourselves. Are we doing that? What does it look like? What is inspiring learners? What's an empowered learner? And continually surfacing it and challenging ourselves so that becomes part of the sort of DNA of the school to the extent possible, not only for teachers, but for kids and for parents. And that's, as international schools with all that turnover, it's an ongoing process, but it has to flow from there. And I think the other thing we shouldn't forget is, schools should be aspirational, inspiring places. And what we're doing is potentially really exciting. Grades aren't exciting, but learning is exciting. And one of the things when we created these learning principles, it was important for us to start with a definition of learning, which essentially says, and that's what I mean by aspirational and inspiring, is that it's a transformative process that changes who we are. Match that up against, here's the rubric for your grades. So I think the way to make that those aspirations and those ideas, like the learning principles and the mission, come alive, it's a daily undertaking, and the courageousness has to do with, if you want to call it that, the bravery, I guess, has to do with the willingness to say we are constantly going to surface that and test what we're doing against what we say we want to be doing. And it doesn't mean that we always succeed. We often don't, but we're not giving up. And I think that's the other piece, that we have to be tenacious. And why do we have to be tenacious? Because we know it's the right thing. It's sort of like, if I tell you to get a flu shot and you don't believe that it's necessarily helpful, I'm not going to stop telling you to get a flu shot because I know what the science says. Well, that's true about learning as well. And so walking the talk is living it and constantly surfacing it and testing it and shining a light on it as we work through our day, in not only big ways, but in small ways.
Thank you. And I think, Teresa, you were bringing up this idea that teachers had that 15% that were not getting the grade, and suddenly their aha moment, and Arnie, you echoed that, was that, well, why don't I do it for everybody? And I'm thinking also, very likely, you don't have to be in a school like yours to engage with that philosophy and that feedback. And I think that's an important message. Maybe if you want to elaborate on that, Teresa, is many teachers are in schools where this journey is far away, it might not happen, but this might really resonate with them in their own practice as a teacher. And what are some things that you might want to guide people in thinking, how can you address this idea of more meaningful learning, even though you're in a graded system? And your teachers obviously came up with this aha and said, well, I can do it for everybody, even though some are going to get a grade.
Yeah, and I think you see that actually around the world. There are a lot of people teachers in their own little context of their classroom actually going grade free, or as much as they can. They're required probably to give grades, quarterly or something on that, but they're refusing to grade everything in Ruberside. Commit Ruberside, which we've created these systems, again, another invented system, which kids don't pay attention to. We know based on the research, all they do is go to the number. So why? What's qualitative feedback? What's going to help the learners? So there are loads of courageous people out there, individuals tackling this in very much more difficult situations than we are. We have, small class, we have very nice kids. We have a lovely situation, so we're quite privileged in that way. But there are courageous people around. The whole grade-free and no grading movement, there are a lot of teachers doing it out there in many, many different systems. So it's quite a network actually you can tap into.
Yeah, just more kind of nuts and bolts. So currently you have focused these prototypes over how many years? Where are you in this journey in the middle school? I just want to make it clear to our listeners that
we started, right, and we started as a prototype, and it was the 2018-19 school year. And so that's when we had 15%, and we regularly met with the students over pizza lunch and just got their insights and their feedback along the way, and then talked with teachers. So it was real focus also on quality feedback, and what's the feedback that really makes a difference, and how are students and learners actioning the feedback, because if they don't do anything with it, it doesn't really matter. So it was a heavy focus on feedback at the same time. And then we were continuing with the prototype with a second round last year. And then, of course, we got hit by COVID like the rest of us. So what we've gone to now is, instead of saying it's a prototype, this is just an option at this point. But I think the big thing is that it's been a cultural shift in the middle school for teachers, and that's an option. And now we're looking at ways, how do we systematize this further, and why, and how could we possibly, already sixth grade after the first half of the year said, oh, why don't we just, why do we have any grades in sixth? Why don't we just fifth to sixth and just have that a transition year, not even do it? And so we're talking about things, what we can do in the middle school to shift this as a bigger cultural shift. And then we'll tackle, of course, upper school as a different ball of wax, because you have the transcripts and whatnot. But as your group has looked at the master transcript, the world is ripe right now. So I think it's a really good time to be part of this larger movement about, really, it's about learning and learners and moving forward versus comparing them.
And I think what's important to understand, you say you started 18, 19, but before that, there was a lot of work that was happening. So there was this whole preamble and preparation. You talk about the mission and the values, and then developing your learning principles. I imagine in tandem, you were doing a lot of professional development, not only for your board of governors, but your teachers, but your parent community and the students. So this is really quite a few years worth of work. It's not suddenly on the 2018, you're like, let's begin. But I think that's really important to emphasize, is the preamble, the pre-work that had to take place.
And you were there, John, for good part of that journey, because when I arrived at ISP more than 10 years ago, we had letter grades in middle and upper school. And the first battle seemed, looking back now, it seemed like not a big deal. Moving from letters to, we decided to use the IB numbers. That was the first piece of it. But simply moving away from letter grades, any school that's done it knows that there's a lot of debate within the parent community, because there's worries about transcripts and so on and so forth. And then the next step, especially in middle schools, we disaggregated. We actually created a learning profile where we have performance standards in the school, and the kids got basically some kind of symbol associated with each one of the standards, but it was disaggregated. There wasn't a math grade or a science grade. Each one of those steps required debate and dissonance and a lot of education and engaging with the community, and that work has to continue. It's not like we're ever going to get there.
Excellent. Well, I don't know if you each have a little piece of wisdom or something, for people that are, really engaged and excited to hear this, and maybe you've provoked them into really thinking about this differently. If there's something you think that, people can walk away with, because you really have been spending quite a lot of time and really doing the research. And as you said, your community has been with you along this journey. So I really get a sense that you have really invested in the time in talking to parents and students. You talk about the pizza lunches and getting feedback, and that really kind of almost a design thinking principle, the way you went about it. Each of you, just a little something as we wrap up?
Go ahead, Teresa, give us some wisdom.
Yeah, COVID fatigue wisdom. No, I think we all have to, if we're going to be true to ourselves, to our profession, and just really rooted in our own ethical beliefs, I think we all have to have the courage to ask ourselves, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And is it truly in the best interests of the learners in front of me right now?
Thank you. Arnie?
And I would add, just don't give up, and let's be excited about what we're doing and how lucky we are to be working with kids in these communities. And the sky is the limit. To go back to Benjamin Zander, who wrote The Art of Possibility, the idea that anything really is possible. And we have to stick to our convictions and be smart about it. You have to play that game. You can't just go in a straight line, because you'll get knocked off pretty quickly. So you have to be smart about it, but you never lose sight of the goal. You always keep your eye on the prize.
Thank you so much. And I really encourage people to go over to your website and kind of look at the values and the learning principles and the mission that you've been working, and also some of the other things that you've shared through the website.
John, if I could add, my blog, school21c.org, has basically articles all the way through the process. Way back, I remember I wrote an article years ago called "Grading Goulash." So I mean, that's some kind of record or archive of that journey we took. So if people want to see that, they can see how we dealt with assessment over time. Because, as you said, every school's at a different place.
Yeah. We'll definitely put that URL on the video so people can access it, and then also the website. Both of you, thank you so much. I know we're all COVID fatigued, but really thank you for taking the time in your very busy day to talk to us, and look forward to hearing more as the journey continues with your school. Thank you.